His intent was nothing less than world domination. A paranoid, manic-depressive man who exploited his friends, his political party, and an entire nation in his desire for conquest and destruction. Adolf Hitler saw himself as the divine inspiration for the German people. A myth of a man who used his own powers of manipulation and the spies in his intelligence network to throw the entire world into chaos. Losing was not an option, and victory would come by any means necessary. Above all, Hitler relied on lies and deceit to achieve his ultimate goals. Deception was the greatest weapon in his arsenal. On Christmas Eve in December 1936, Adolf Hitler approved a request from the chief of his Nazi Party's intelligence office, Reinhard Heydrich, to leak a report that Heydrich had supposedly intercepted to Czechoslovakian President Edvard Benes in Prague. The report detailed conversations between Marshal Tukhachevsky, Russian First Vice Commissar for Defense, and British military leaders. Tukhachevsky had met with the British while representing the Soviet Union at the state funeral of King George V. There, he supposedly told them about a plan that he and other Russian generals had created to remove Joseph Stalin from power. The report also described Tukhachevsky as a seasoned German spy with close access to Hitler, his generals, and German military plans going back many years. The information about Tukhachevsky was very damning. It was also totally false. Hitler knew that the Soviet military leadership was weak. Getting Stalin to believe his top officers were out to get him would weaken it even more. Hitler knew the information would eventually get back to Stalin. The story of Tukhachevsky's meeting with the British actually came from a disgruntled general inside the Soviet secret police. General Nikola Skoblin had hated the Red Army for years, ever since he'd supported a rival faction during the Russian Revolution. At a clandestine meeting at the Hotel Adlon in Berlin, Skoblin gave his bogus report to his friend Reinhard Heydrich. The Nazis used it to their fullest advantage. In fact, the part about Tukhachevsky being a German spy was Heydrich's own personal touch.
Reinhard Heydrich was an evil figure. He had developed a plan to blackmail Tukhachevsky and other officers using their old connections with Germans, and accusing them of being German spies who had infiltrated the Soviet army.
In den 20er Jahren dieses Jahrhunderts, als Deutschland nur eine kleine Reichswehr hatte.
In the 1920s, when Germany was allowed to have just a little army with neither tanks nor planes, there was a close cooperation, almost friendship, between the German army and the Red Army.
The file on Tukhachevsky and other top Soviet generals eventually reached the Kremlin. Stalin took Heydrich's bait. The embattled Russian leader was furious. He feared that his own generals were about to remove him. He removed them instead.
There is a feeling in Stalin's circle that the fascists may be inside the circle itself, that there should be purges. Well, Stalin has been used to purges. He's been purging various organs of the Soviet Union for 10 or 15 years, at least by then.
On June 11, 1937, Tukhachevsky and 7 other top generals were executed without a trial. However, the state-run Soviet newspaper Pravda reported there was a legitimate trial and proclaimed the convictions a victory for the Communist Party. But the true victor was Hitler's intelligence network. The executions began a bloody rampage by Stalin. In 1 year, Stalin's secret police force executed 41 generals, 93 corps commanders, and all of the 293 division commanders of the Red Army. The slaughter sent the Kremlin into turmoil and set the stage for one of Hitler's greatest double-crosses in the years to come. In order to carry out his policies without question, Hitler knew he needed to become a god in the eyes of the German people. He exerted complete command over their perceptions of him, controlling what they heard, what they saw, and what they knew. Then he released this image to the international community. Hitler used propaganda masterfully to cover one of his greatest secrets on the eve of World War II.
Hitler has a grasp of what propaganda is all about. Today, we look upon propaganda as an aspect of intelligence. He knows that newsreels, radio, and airplanes, these three modern inventions, can be controlled by the state. So he's the state.
From the time he was elected chancellor in 1933, Hitler seized every opportunity to influence the masses inside Germany. Movie theater newsreels were a popular way to keep Germans informed of current events. Filled with Nazi-controlled images of a reborn Germany, newsreels helped galvanize support for Hitler's rearmament program in the 1930s. Newsreel images were ideal for international propaganda efforts. Instead of trying to hide the fact that he was in violation of the Treaty of Versailles by rearming the Luftwaffe and army, Hitler reveled in it. The cameras rolled and the world looked on in amazement. But the rebuilt military shown on newsreels did not represent the strength of the German armed forces. Hitler organized tours to display Germany's military might for foreign officials and press. But often the trips were a hoax. As soon as the reporters packed up and headed for another base, the planes at the base just visited were flown ahead of them. When the journalists and dignitaries arrived, they had no clue that the planes were the same aircraft they had just seen. In 1936, Hitler took his biggest gamble yet. He ordered his army to reposition itself west of the Rhine River, also in clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles.
The German army was no match for the French army, and Hitler himself had given the orders that should the French show any signs of opposition, should they move, then those very, very few battalions that had gone into the Rhineland at Cologne and other places were to withdraw. And Hitler, the rest of his life kept on saying that this was, in fact, the most sort of dicey moment of his life, and that, had the French made a move, perhaps he would have ended his life there and then.
In March 1938, German troops annexed Austria. The Wehrmacht had secret orders to retreat if France objected, but there was no formal protest from Paris. In September of the same year, Hitler demanded that the German-speaking territory of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, be part of the Third Reich. The European powers, including Britain and France, hoped to avoid war with Germany. They signed the Munich Agreement, effectively turning over 11,000 square miles of Czech territory to Hitler. Then, on August 23, 1939, Hitler shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact with Stalin. They secretly agreed to invade Poland and divide it between them. Hitler knew France and England had treaties with Poland and would come to her aid, but he was willing to gamble once again. At the time, France was the only European nation capable of stopping a German advance across the continent. France had roughly the same number of troops and equipment as the Germans, but the French were leery. They had lost more than 1 million men during World War I, double the number lost by the British. One of the ironies of Hitler's propaganda war is that French intelligence operatives knew that Germany wasn't as strong as it seemed. Their warnings were ignored.
The French intelligence has pretty well perceived what is real, but they're not getting through to the political leadership. It's a classic story of intelligence. I mean, there almost seems to be some kind of a rule that says the better and more timely the intelligence, the less likely any political leadership will make use of it.
Hitler also used a deceptive olive branch by preaching pacifism. He purposefully played on fears still fresh from the slaughter of World War I. He gave speeches which were reported by newspapers and newsreels about the useless sacrifices he had seen as a soldier, of men who died in efforts to capture a few yards of land. Hitler would later say that he secretly played on the world's sweet reasonableness.
He said, "You don't think I, a soldier of the Great War that went through 4 years of mud and blood and slaughter, would ever start another world war, do you?" And of course, a lot of people were fooled by this old story. But of course, it was also accompanied by these mass demonstrations of German military might.
It was one of Hitler's greatest secrets. He wanted to take over Europe, but his forces were not ready. Even Hitler's top generals knew at this stage that there was no way they could win a world war.
After all, the French army was many times larger than the German army. The French had more tanks than the German. The British had more planes than the German. And behind them, all the time, was lurking the possibility of assistance from the United States.
Still, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler went ahead. His blitzkrieg overran Poland in a month. France could have attacked, but didn't. 9 months of political maneuvering ensued, which only allowed the Germans to strengthen their forces. Then, in the spring of 1940, despite repeated warnings from French intelligence, the Nazis overran Belgium, Holland, and France in just 8 weeks. Although Hitler's string of daring victories in Western Europe stalled as his air forces were repelled during the Battle of Britain, his eyes had already turned to the east. When he signed the non-aggression pact with Stalin in August of 1939, Hitler promised not to attack Russia. But the Führer knew that his earlier deception had led Stalin to kill nearly 1/3 of his senior army staff by 1940. Younger, less experienced communist officers now led the Soviet army. Hitler's most brazen double-cross of the war, the top-secret invasion of Russia, known as Operation Barbarossa, was about to be put into action.
This is a result of all these purges. Hitler clung to this idea, so that in December 1940 he says, "You only have to kick the door and the whole rotten structure will fall in."
In the fall of 1941, the Wehrmacht invaded Russian territory, wiping out the defending forces at a clip that surprised the most battle-hardened German officers. At one point, the German army was only 30 miles from Moscow. In the years to come, the Russians would regroup to fight another day and repel the invaders. But at the time, Hitler's grand deception had paid off in droves. For the time being, Europe was locked in stalemate, but Hitler and his secret operatives continued to stretch their subversive tentacles. The Führer was about to entangle a sleeping giant on the other side of the Atlantic as he brought his covert war to the United States. Even before the outbreak of World War II, as the United States was climbing out of the Great Depression, America's military industry was quietly preparing for the future. In Brooklyn, New York, engineers were building the most accurate aerial bomb sighting device ever made. U.S. Air Corps officials boasted that the device, known as the Norden bomb sight, could guide a bomb from several thousand feet with such precision it could hit a barrel of pickles. Among the engineers who worked at the factory in 1937 was a German-American named Hermann Lang. Unknown to his fellow workers, Lang was also an agent for German intelligence. The Nazis were determined to penetrate the factory and obtain information on the top-secret bomb site.
This thing was guarded by all the security they could dream up. But what Lang did is he took a plan home every night and copied it. and he smuggled out these plans one at a time across to Germany. And German engineers over there, using his plans, made a working model of the Norden bomb site.
By 1937, the Luftwaffe not only had the United States' top-secret Norden bomb site, they had improved it. By 1942, Hitler's Air Force ruled the skies of nearly all of Europe with a reign of terror from precision bombing. After this great success, Hermann Lang teamed up with Colonel Fritz Duquesne, who'd been spying for Germany for more than 20 years. However, a double agent named William Siebold tipped off the FBI to their activities. Siebold followed his German handler's instructions to meet Duquesne. In a series of meetings in May 1941, Siebold lured Duquesne and his cohorts to a downtown New York office building. The FBI secretly recorded this film of their meeting. Duquesne had a gold mine of secrets with his theft of plans for PT boats and the M1 rifle. His spying operations called for the plans to be given to Heinrich Clausing, a cook on the ocean liner Argentina. With Siebold's help, Duquesne set up a shortwave radio on Long Island to send information back to Germany. Duquesne didn't know that the radio operator also worked for the FBI, and all the reports radioed to Germany were contrived. In January 1942, Duquesne was stopped before he could do any damage. He and 32 other German agents were arrested, tried, and convicted on espionage charges. Most of them served more than 10 years in prison. Later that year, Hitler would make his boldest attempt yet to disrupt the American war machine. With the war well underway, Hitler's dream of bringing the battle to the American home front was about to come true. On June 13, 1942, a German U-boat captain switched off his diesel engines and quietly drifted in the waters just off the coast of Amagansett, Long Island. On board the cramped submarine were 4 German agents. Each had lived in the United States for several years before the war. Each had returned home to Nazi Germany to be trained as saboteurs. Now they were coming back as agents for the fatherland on a covert assignment dubbed Operation Pastorius. Under the cover of darkness, the 4 men rowed their rubber raft towards a deserted stretch of the Long Island shore. Their clothes and way of speech were undeniably American. In their pockets were United States passports, maps, identification cards, and cash. The leader, George Dash, was holding $30,000 in small bills. The agents were also carrying 3 cases filled with plastic explosives. Their mission was to blow up 3 Alcoa light metal manufacturing plants, one in Illinois, another in Tennessee, and a third in New York. German intelligence knew the facilities were crucial to the production of American military aircraft. If the saboteurs succeeded, Hitler could claim a major victory on U.S. soil.
You have to remember that in 1942 there were no ballistic missiles and there were no long-range bombers. And so America was out of Hitler's reach. He couldn't drop a bomb on a steel mill or a munitions plant. So this was his way of slowing down American production.
The group's leader, George Dash, had lived in the United States for 19 years, married an American, and even served 2 years in the U.S. Army. After he was drafted into German intelligence, he began to distrust the Nazis and their politics. Now, as the agents waded ashore, George Dash was having doubts about the mission. On the beach, they buried their rubber raft and explosives just in time. Coast Guardsman John Cullen was patrolling the shore nearby and unknowingly stumbled upon the German saboteurs. Dash told Cullen they were fishermen and their boat had run aground in the fog. Cullen accepted the explanation and even offered them some hot coffee back at the station. They declined. But as the gathering broke up, Dash made his move. He pulled the Coast Guardsmen aside. Away from the others, Dash offered Cullen a bribe of $260, hoping to tip off the operation. But the crew left the beach before the stunned Coast Guardsman reacted. He went back to the station and filed a report. By the time the police and authorities showed up, Dash and his co-saboteurs had disappeared. They boarded a train headed for New York City. 4 days later, on a beach near Jacksonville, Florida, 4 more German agents showed up. From there, the agents were taken by Nazi sympathizers to hotels near the factories around the country they planned to destroy. According to the plan, bombs would be placed on the towers feeding electricity to the plants. An agent would set a fuse in the bomb, light it, and run. Meanwhile, without telling the group, George Dash decided to reveal their covert operation and placed calls to the FBI.
George Dash, unfortunately, had a tendency, when excited, when rattled, he would just babble on, sometimes incoherently, and that's what he did in this stage. Apparently, the FBI just wrote him off as a crank, because the FBI used to get crank calls like this all the time.
But Dash didn't quit. Determined to put an end to Operation Pastorius before any damage was done, he traveled by train to Washington, D.C. and went to the FBI headquarters.
There were several agents in the room, and they listened to him, and he could tell by the expression on their face, and he wasn't getting through to them. At that stage, he took the suitcase full of money and said, "This is my proof, here," and took the entire suitcase, dumped it on the table, and it spilled all over the place. At that stage, they started to believe his story.
Dash talked for 8 days. He revealed the details of the operation, as well as the whereabouts of his fellow agents and the hidden explosive devices. 2 weeks after they first landed on Long Island and in Florida, all 8 Nazi saboteurs were in U.S. custody. Operation Pastorius was exposed not by the FBI, but by the conscience of a German spy. Yet, Bureau Director J. Edgar Hoover covered up Dash's confession and let the FBI take full credit for the arrests. Hoover believed that a speedy trial and death sentences for all the imprisoned German agents would leave no one to contradict his story.
The recent landing of saboteurs from Nazi submarines sounds a new alert for all Americans. These saboteurs were apprehended before they could carry out their plans of destruction. Other saboteurs may try to come to our shores. They must be stopped.
A military trial was held. It lasted 3 weeks. All the saboteurs were found guilty and sentenced to death. Although President Roosevelt was in favor of harsh sentences, he learned the truth of how the operation was stopped, and at the last moment stepped in and commuted the sentences of George Dash and another saboteur, Ernest Berger, to life in prison. The remaining 6 prisoners died in the electric chair within 63 minutes of each other. It was the fastest mass execution in U.S. history. Had it been successful, Operation Pastorius would have brought the war home to America with a major propaganda victory for Germany. But even as Hitler's plans of sabotage in America were compromised, German intelligence officers began plotting actions within Germany against the Führer. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was Germany's top military spy master and the man closest to Hitler and his secret war. The Führer trusted him implicitly. Canaris had graduated from the German Naval Academy in 1908. He served on the battleship cruiser Dresden, which was blown out of the water off the coast of Chile during World War I. Canaris survived and was decorated for outstanding bravery by Kaiser Wilhelm. The war hero caught the attention of Hitler in the early days of his political career. After the Nazi Party leader became Germany's new chancellor, Canaris was appointed as head of military intelligence, an organization known as the Abwehr. But whatever loyalty he felt towards Hitler suddenly and dramatically evaporated. Hitler had secretly ordered the elimination of his political opposition on the evening of June 30th, 1934. Hundreds of his political rivals were executed. It would be remembered as the Night of the Long Knives. The brutality and cowardice of these murders shocked Canaris. From that night on, the Admiral vowed to undermine Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party.
Admiral Canaris was sort of a rare bird. He was a military man, but he had a conscience. And he did not like the Nazis. He did not like what they were doing. He could see what was leading up.
Canaris bided his time, seeming to serve Hitler, but waiting for opportune times to subvert him. The opportunity finally arrived 5 years later with the outbreak of World War II. Canaris, now committed to Hitler's eventual demise, often made sure the Führer had incomplete or false information when making strategic decisions. As Germany invaded Poland, Canaris informed Hitler that the French were going to mount an attack in the Somme region. As a result, Hitler kept numerous divisions on the French border and out of Poland, but the attack never came. By the summer of 1940, Hitler's war machine was in high gear. The Nazis were sweeping across Europe. The curtain of fascism now extended over Poland, Denmark, and Norway. German troops were marching into Paris, and the Luftwaffe was battling for Britain. All that Hitler needed now was a way to tighten the noose and choke Europe into total submission. He set his sights on the Straits of Gibraltar, the western access to the Mediterranean Sea. Hitler knew that controlling this 8-mile-wide channel would wreak havoc on the enemy's war effort. English supply ships would be prevented from reaching the Eighth Army fighting General Rommel in North Africa. If Hitler could occupy the Straits, the entire Mediterranean would be his. A major turning point in the war was just one victory away.
To take Gibraltar would be a body blow for the British. It would have been psychologically damaging to the British, and it would have been terribly damaging in terms of losing the Mediterranean as a takeoff point for hitting the soft underbelly of Europe.
But reaching the British-controlled tip of Spain would be difficult. Sending troops by sea meant traveling hundreds of extra miles in dangerous Allied-occupied waters. The only feasible route was over land, through Spain. A plan was devised. Codenamed Operation Felix, the scheme first called for negotiations with Spanish dictator Francisco Franco. Hitler sent Canaris to pave the way and open the door to Gibraltar. He had no idea that his chief spy would do exactly the opposite.
Canaris had known Franco from shortly after World War I. Canaris had been the man who negotiated with Franco for all the German assistance to Spain during the revolution, in which Franco came out on top. Canaris said to Franco, "Whatever you do, don't let the German troops come into Spain." Why? Because Germany is not going to win this war.
To further his deception, Canaris embellished his report to Hitler. It gave a very bleak assessment for Operation Felix. Canaris stressed that railway lines between France and Spain were incompatible, making troop transports technically unfeasible. Many of the roads were narrow and made of dirt, making it impossible for German armored divisions to get through. Finally, Canaris concluded that the British were well entrenched at Gibraltar, and getting them out would be impossible.
In fact, the situation was just the opposite. He could have said, if you really want to do this, just do it. If Franco gives you any problems, just push him out of the way, invade Spain, push your way through to Gibraltar, and launch a major attack. I'm sure he could have done it, and he would have been successful.
Despite the pessimistic report by his chief spy, Hitler would not yield on Gibraltar. On September 23, 1940, the Führer himself made a personal visit to Spain and met with Franco to discuss Gibraltar. Franco was already prepared for the meeting, thanks to Canaris. Hitler wanted to invade Gibraltar through Spain. Franco agreed, but there were a few conditions.
He wanted more money, more grain. He demanded heavy naval artillery, which he knew Hitler did not have because Canaris had told him. So he was making impossible demands on Hitler to dissuade him.
Hitler was flabbergasted. Franco was making demands that he could never agree to. The final blow came over dinner. Franco told Hitler he had no intention of becoming an ally of Germany and that Spain would remain neutral in the war. At the end of the meeting, Franco dropped a bombshell and told his German guest that he believed the Allies would win the war. Hitler left, saying he would rather have teeth pulled than meet with Franco again. He never suspected that his top spy had anything to do with keeping Spain out of the war and leaving the strategic Straits of Gibraltar in British hands.
No blame was ever placed on Canaris at all. He was very good at that. He just sidestepped it. Hitler just placed all the blame on Franco being hard-headed.
But Canaris's misinformation campaign did not end with Spain. In 1942, the Allies were preparing to launch Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa. A German agent working undercover in London learned of the secret plan and sent an urgent message to Canaris at German intelligence headquarters in Berlin. The report provided details of the exact time and place when Allied troops would invade. But then the report mysteriously disappeared.
Of course, Canaris didn't know anything about it. He never heard of any such report. What report is that? Never heard of it, sorry. So in this case, it wasn't a sin of commission, it was a sin of omission. He just neglected to file the report. You know, he conveniently lost it. And things like that were happening all the time.
Late in the war, Italy was about to make a dramatic switch to leave the Axis powers and to join the Allies. Once again, Canaris fed Hitler false information. Hitler believed that the Italians would soon side with the Allies, but Canaris reported that Italy would stay loyal to Germany. In reality, Hitler's military intelligence chief knew better. Italy switched sides, robbing Hitler's Axis empire of badly needed men and material. But Canaris did not live to see the end of the Nazi regime. He was arrested in July 1944 in connection with the attempted bomb assassination of Hitler. Months later, his private diary surfaced with evidence of treasonous activity going back to 1934. In the closing days of the war, Canaris was hanged by SS men, slowly, with piano wire. The assassination attempt gave rise to Hitler's belief that he was the target of a massive conspiracy. Even as the Allies were about to land in Normandy, the greatest fears and deepest suspicions for the leader of Nazi Germany centered on those closest to him. Everyone was considered a suspect. Alone and trusting almost no one, Hitler's paranoia would fuel his own demise and the ruin of his country in the following year. Despite the fact that Germany's top spymaster, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, and others were subverting Hitler's goals, German military intelligence did still enjoy some successes during World War II. One effective scheme occurred in Holland. It was called Operation North Pole. Britain's Special Operations Executive, the SOE, continually landed secret agents in Europe. In the words of Winston Churchill, they were to give aid and comfort and active support to the European resistance movement. In March 1941, the German Abwehr forced a captured British radio operator to transmit messages back to SOE in Britain. Joseph Schreider was one of the chief operatives for the Abwehr. Throughout the war, Schreider continued to send messages to radio operators in England, reporting on bridges that were destroyed and troops killed. To the British, the operation seemed very successful.
The radio keeps sending back false reports of sabotage that had been committed by the agents. So back in England, they believe they've got a red-hot resistance unit working day and night against the Germans. In reality, nothing's happening except every agent who is sent over is killed.
But many of the British agents were often captured and killed within days of landing in the Netherlands. Those that were not executed were forced to participate in the deception.
The Germans were very good at radio finding. They could send cars around in a neighborhood and find where the secret transmission was being sent. So getting the radio operators was relatively easy.
The Allies continued to send men and munitions as the German operatives fed them false radio information. But soon, reports coming from other Allied sources conflicted with messages from Joseph Schreider. Slowly, intelligence operatives in England began to grow suspicious.
The thing about the North Pole is that some SOE personnel in London smelt a rat, did think in fact that this seemed to be too good to be true, but their warnings seemingly weren't acted upon.
In May 1943, 2 of the captured British SOE agents managed to escape and get word back to England about the operation. Soon after, the replies to the false German messages were halted, and Operation North Pole was over. Ironically, the 2 British agents were imprisoned for giving aid to the Nazis. It was not until the war's end that the Allies discovered the extent of the deception and devastation caused by Operation North Pole. In 2.5 years of sending radio broadcasts, Schreider received parachute drops of 35,000 pounds of explosives, 3,500 guns, and 2,000 hand grenades. 47 British intelligence agents lost their lives. The cunning with which Operation North Pole was conceived and executed was a model of how Hitler wanted his covert operations to run. The SS, the Nazi Party's police force, carried out another successful covert operation. Known for their ruthlessness and terror through assassination and intimidation, the SS moved throughout Europe, confiscating anything of value that could finance their own operations. Gold, jewelry, paintings, and entire factories were seized for the fatherland. Yet, in one of their most secret operations, the SS made their own money. An SD agent, Alfred Naujax, came up with a scheme to ruin the British economy. The plan called for millions of forged pound notes to be dropped on England and neutral countries. They hoped this would cause severe inflation, leading to the eventual collapse of the country's economies. When Hitler approved the plan in 1942, Naujax and his men began to seek out counterfeiters.
It suddenly occurred to them that they had, as prisoners of the German government, master Jewish forgers. So they actively went through the backgrounds on these individuals and came up with the forgers, the photography experts, the experts in numbering, the experts in logistics, and they recruited from these prisoners an entire team.
The lure was simple. The SD officers promised them better living conditions, better food, and more recreation time. Most importantly, they promised them their lives if they created a flawless forgery. The prisoners were transferred to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. When they produced their first forgeries, SD agent Wilhelm Hodel was asked to vouch for their authenticity.
That's when I personally found out through one of my men, who went bold-faced into a leading Swiss bank and showed them the notes, saying he had heard that fake banknotes had been circulating and he wanted to have them examined. And the clerk said, "I can only congratulate you if you have many more of these notes. They are guaranteed to be genuine."
Here was now a source of hard British currency that they could use with their agents. They could use it for bribes. They bought weapons in Yugoslavia. When they rescued Mussolini from his captors, the operation was paid for using forged British banknotes.
More than 100 million pound notes were eventually printed, but they were never dropped on England. When the Allies closed in on Germany, the forging operation was rushed to Austria, where the counterfeiters were eventually freed. As the noose tightened around Hitler's Reich, the Germans had one more chance to turn the tables of war by building an atomic bomb. It was to be Germany's ultimate weapon that would have changed the course of history. But making a German bomb would prove difficult, mostly due to the actions of Hitler himself. In 1938, German scientists working at the Berlin Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry changed the world when they found the key to atomic reaction. The nuclear age was underway. But before the shades of war fell over Europe, Hitler's racial policies against the Jews had sent many of Germany's top scientists fleeing, including Albert Einstein.
The people who discover this primarily are people who leave Germany, Einstein being a wonderful example. They're Jews, several of them. They are intellectuals. They're part of the university system. They're part of the scientific community that has connections with other scientists all over the world. Everything about the people who would be the real architects of a bomb for Germany are the wrong kinds of Germans for the German Nazis.
Those who remained began work on Hitler's version of an atomic bomb. Even as a theoretical possibility, Hitler described the atomic bomb as the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon. With his patented hyperbole, Hitler would describe the bomb to his war-weary generals, claiming it would be the ultimate instrument of destruction. But he was weary of the bomb as well. A scientist once cautioned him that it was possible that an atomic chain reaction could continue without stopping, obliterating the world. Afraid to put too many secrets in the hands of one group, Hitler allowed 3 separate groups to pursue the development of the atomic bomb, believing one would get it right. With control of Czechoslovakia, the German scientists had access to Europe's primary producer of uranium. All they needed now was an element to stabilize a chain reaction. Werner Heisenberg was the lead physicist of the group backed by the German army. Heisenberg recognized that heavy water created by the separation of hydrogen and oxygen in water would be the key to building a nuclear reactor. The principal source for heavy water in Europe at the time was the Norwegian Hydroelectric Company in southern Norway. In 1939, the plant produced only 10 kilograms of heavy water per month, barely enough for experimentation. When the Nazis invaded Norway in April of 1940, Heisenberg had the access he needed. Within months, production of heavy water increased to 4 kilograms per day, and security around the plant was doubled. In the summer of 1941, the Norwegian underground brought word of the plant's activities to the Allies. There was only one explanation for the increased production of heavy water, and only one solution. During 1942 and 1943, the Allies mounted 3 unsuccessful attacks on the hydroelectric plant. Although each attack slowed production, the Germans quickly repaired whatever damage was done to the facility. Still, the attacks were enough to convince them that Norway was too close to Allied territory to continue the project. Weary from having to protect such an isolated production plant that was crucial to making atomic weapons, they disassembled the heavy water equipment and shipped it to Germany. On February 30th, 1944, the Germans packed 600 kilograms of heavy water into 40 drums and placed the cargo on a ferry boat. Within hours, the vessel was at the bottom of Lake Tinja, courtesy of the Norwegian underground. But Allied paranoia over an atomic Germany was not confined to Norway. On March 1st, 1943, Germany's top nuclear scientists were called to a meeting in Berlin by Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe. Goering wanted to discuss his concerns about aerial bombing. During the meeting, the scientists were subjected to just that. Allied bombs showered central Berlin. The scientists survived a direct hit only by rushing into an underground shelter. But the Allies didn't stop there. They began devising a plan to either kidnap or kill Werner Heisenberg. The plan was dropped after Army officials realized that the Manhattan Project, the secret U.S. program to build an atomic bomb, was advancing more quickly than the German program. Ironically, the primary reason the American scientists were moving ahead was due to Hitler himself. His interest in the project simply waned.
Hitler's perception becomes the important matter for everything. He doesn't like modern art. Well, there's no modern art. He's not sure you could put any of your resources into jet plane. There's almost no jet plane till toward the end of the war, and they force it on him. He didn't have a feeling of need in terms of the atomic bomb.
Ultimately, the three research teams that attempted to develop the bomb wound up working against each other. Their secret developments were often redundant, and they withheld advances from each other. How close was Germany to making an atomic weapon? Following the surrender of Germany, the Allies gathered Werner Heisenberg and the rest of Germany's nuclear scientists in a country house called Hall Farm near Cambridge, England. They secretly placed recording devices in the house and gave the scientists newspapers after the bombing of Hiroshima in August 1945.
And they listened to hear what the Germans were saying. And it was immediately clear from what the German physicists were saying that they weren't even close to making an atomic bomb. So the British and the Americans breathed an enormous sigh of relief.
Hitler did not live to see Germany surrender. He committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, as Berlin crumbled around him. But more than half a century after his death, some of his secrets are still being revealed. With his signature in 1935, Hitler signed into effect the Nuremberg Laws. He and his Nazi party crafted these laws to strip Jews of their rights in Germany, eventually prohibiting them from interacting with non-Jews. These were the only documents that officially linked Hitler to the anti-Semitism which subsequently led the Nazis to murder 6 million European Jews, a policy which the world has come to know as the Holocaust. Although it has always been known what the Nuremberg Laws proclaimed, the whereabouts of the original documents was a mystery for decades. The Allies first discovered them in April of 1945. Soldiers of the U.S. Third Army found the original Nuremberg Laws in a bank vault as they moved through the town of Eichstätt in southern Germany. Then they disappeared again. Apparently, General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, brought the documents back home to Southern California after the war. The Nuremberg Laws were among other papers that Patton had donated to the Huntington Library in Pasadena, California, shortly before he died in a car accident. It was not until 1999 that the library revealed the existence of the documents.
I think we're reminding people by displaying these documents that these are documents which lead to death and darkness, we're also reminding people that Hitler did not have the last word, which means that the victor in all of this was democracy that actually loosened this genocidal grip that Hitler had on Europe and was hoping to have on the world.
An extraordinary signature on a seemingly ordinary document. These papers are yet another tangible reminder of Hitler and his dream of a German Reich that would dominate the world through deception and deceit and last 1,000 years.